On today's Locked On Jayhawks, Kansas and Lance Leipold have a new elite punter, and they possibly have a new player to get the Hawk position. Transfer portal breakdown on today's episode.
You are Locked On Jayhawks, your daily podcast on the Kansas Jayhawks. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
What's happening? Derek Johnson here. This is Locked On Jayhawks. Thanks for making it your first listen every day. Thank you to the everydayers catching each and every show, and thank you to you for listening wherever you are, wherever you get your podcasts, including on our YouTube page. We're going to be breaking down some new KU football transfer portal additions on today's show. Lance Leipold bringing in an elite punter. I do not mess around with that word. And Laquan Robinson is a player who could possibly be a Hawk player for KU, not just a Jayhawk. It's a position for the KU defense. We'll explain what that means and get into that in today's episode. Plus, we'll finish up here with a little bit about what are the remaining needs for KU and Lance Leipold to try to fill in the portal. Today's episode of the show is brought to you by Game Time. Download the Game Time app, create an account, and use code LOCKEDONCollege for $20 off your first purchase with Game Time. All right, so let's talk about Laquan Robinson off the rip here before we get into KU's new elite punter in Finn Lapin. This is Laquan Robinson. He is a safety / linebacker coming from Auburn. So I don't know if him and Gage Keys were good buddies and Gage Keys put in a good word, or, he told Laquan Robinson, like, hey, trust me, like, good things are going on around here, like, come on out. Whatever ended up happening, I think works out for the best here for KU, and I think for Laquan Robinson. He 6'1", 204 pounds out of Greenville, Alabama. Now that size would probably be more corollary to what like a safety would be. Like Marvin Grant was around that weight. I think he was a little bit heavier, but that would kind of indicate safety. And he out of high school, out of Greenville, Alabama, went to Holmes Community College for 2 seasons, and so. He ends up at Holmes Community College, where he did play the safety position. Over 2 seasons at Holmes Community College, he totaled 95 tackles, 5.5 TFLs, 7 pass breakups, 2 interceptions, and a fumble recovery. And that production over the 2 years was enough for him to be ranked the 15th overall JUCO recruit in the country at all positions. So top 20 JUCO recruit in the country. Now, some of those JUCO rankings maybe are a little bit different now than they were 5-10 years ago before the portal really became rampant to this point in time. But I do think, even though maybe there's not as much just depth of talent now at the JUCO ranks than there was maybe 10 years ago, because players just, bounce around the portal to other teams, it still is. It almost feels like, to me, it's now becoming an under-recruited area for people to go to, because teams are just living in the transfer portal. And I do think you can find some good talent at the JUCO level because of that it almost becomes the money ball, so to speak, right? Like where is value not being placed, and can you find some there? So he ends up being ranked that. In addition to that, he was also ranked the #1 safety at the junior college level, according to the 24/7 Sports composite. So he ends up picking Auburn over other SEC offers like Texas A&M, like Arkansas. I mean, obviously for a guy from Greenville, Alabama, you'd imagine you're getting to play in your home state and play at Auburn, probably a pretty cool dream come true for him. There were other schools that obviously offered as well, but those were the ones that kind of stuck out. And so he goes to Auburn this past season, and he played in just 1 game. He recorded just 5 snaps. So like, I could tell you that he had a 72.6 PFF grade, and that sounds great, but it was 5 snaps against Alabama A&M. So I don't think there's really too much we can take from the limited amount of playing time that he had this year for Auburn. He ended up being able to preserve a red shirt because he only played in the 1 game. So that's good, because now that he comes over to Kansas, he comes in as a, redshirt junior for the 2025 season, right? He'll be player played 2 years at JUCO, redshirted at Auburn. He'll be a redshirt junior. So that gives him 2 seasons left for KU, at least in theory. And what I mean by that is basically, so Diego Pavia, who is this really good quarterback for Vanderbilt, transferred from New Mexico State. Before he was at New Mexico State, Diego Pavia was at the junior college ranks, and he ended up suing the NCAA this year for an extra year of eligibility. Basically, the basis of it was that his time at JUCO did not allow him to, make NIL money because he didn't have the same notoriety. Like, there's just not that level of being able to, make earnings from NIL at the JUCO level that there would be obviously at the Division I level. And so basically sued him for an extra year of eligibility that the JUCO ranks shouldn't count. And so what is going to be the repercussions of this? Like, that remains to be seen. Is it going to have an impact on D2 and D3 and NAIA, where those players could play at schools for 4 years there and then eventually come up to Division I and say that, well, I couldn't make NIL at my D2 and you're preventing me from being able to make money if you're saying I'm out of eligibility. So, like, I have no idea how that stuff's going to work out, and we don't need to get into all that on today's episode. But point being, he basically won the case. Now, it was kind of an individual thing for him, so it's not that the NCAA has changed the rule to say that now all these JUCO players, those years don't count. But it basically created the framework, and I'm far from a lawyer. I'm far from knowing things in the court of law, but I do believe that if you have like precedent over something, over a court case winning, that usually probably is pretty good for other people who, if they wanted to sue the NCAA, could probably operate under that same argument that cleared Diego Pavia. And again, I don't know if it would be dependent on like what state is occupying the was this a federal thing? Was it a state court? I don't know how that all works. Again, I'm far from knowing that sort of stuff. But basically, it gets to a point where if enough kids start suing the NCAA and they're like, hey, I want my eligibility, and they're winning the cases, and the NCAA keeps losing, which I feel like the NCAA just always loses in court no matter what it ends up being. So like, chances are that's going to happen. And then all of a sudden the NCAA is just like, screw this. Why do we keep, paying all these lawyer fees and losing all these battles and losing PR, all this stuff? Let's just make it, that's the rule. That's the rule now, and we don't have to deal with it. We don't have to get sued anymore, right? And so that kind of feels like that is where things are going. Now, again, it's not a guarantee, and I don't know to what level that's going to mean, because Pavia's situation could end up being different than a player like Laquan Robinson. But circling this back in to what Laquan Robinson brings to the table at KU, if hypothetically we get to the point where the NCAA is saying, yeah, JUCO years don't count, then in theory, you would be having a player who would technically be a redshirt freshman by just NCAA rules. So I think you look at it right now if you're Kansas and say, okay, you have 2 years left of Laquan Robinson. But if you end up getting 3, you end up getting 4, that's just the cherry on top. And you hope that certainly is the case for a team that as many seniors as they lost or will lose, I guess, after this graduating year. They're going to be losing a bunch more seniors after next season too. So I think that'll be very interesting. Now, as far as how he impacts the team, he was a safety at the JUCO ranks, but he was a linebacker at Auburn. He ended up switching over to the linebacker position at Auburn and was part of the scout team. And was that just because Auburn was maybe thin on the scout team linebacker and they needed him to move up? Was that something where he benefited in playing there? Was, what is that going to mean? But I find that very interesting when you look at somebody who clearly, between where he has played, you almost view that as being like a linebacker safety tweener. And maybe I shouldn't use the word tweener, because I feel like that has a negative connotation, and I don't want it to be. Like, I think that's a good thing for this specific role and this specific fit for KU, because Kansas has played this hawk position. And what the hawk position is essentially your third linebacker / fifth defensive back. And there are different rules of it for KU. They have different terminologies. Like, there are certain downs where they call it a cinco. And I believe that's when they're playing like a nickel defense. Typically a nickel defense is when you're playing a fifth defensive back, nickel 5, right? Makes sense. So they call it a cinco. And in those more passing downs, it typically is more of a DB. Now, in maybe more rundowns, early downs, that hawk position is more of somebody who's going to stop the run, more of a linebacker who is more versatile to defend against the pass. And obviously, KU felt like they had the best of both worlds when they had Craig Young, who had the athleticism of a corner and a safety, but had the size of a linebacker. Last year, or I guess this past year, if you want to call it, they had to sprinkle a little bit more, right? In certain situations, it was Marvin Grant. In other situations, maybe it was Jason Gilliam or Alex Reich, right? So it just kind of depended. Maybe it was a third corner out there for KU. It just kind of depended on the situation. But if you have the right player to fit into that, it makes things so much easier. Now, we don't know if Kansas is going to still have a hawk, right? Because it's a new defensive coordinator, DK McDonald, taking over for Brian Borland. Is it going to be the same? Is it going to be different? We'll see, right? But I do find it interesting that if you look back to what Iowa State has traditionally done, which is where DK McDonald was before Kansas, was before the Philadelphia Eagles, they typically play 3 safeties. And you probably want your third safety to be, kind of a linebacker safety hybrid in that system. And so, again, I look to Laquan Robinson. And so we don't know how good he's going to be. Is he going to be good enough to, start right away? Is he going to be a player that's going to be on the 2 deep this year and then will be a starter in 2026? Is he going to be somebody who is just, depth and provides a good piece of depth for you in special teams player? We don't know because, again, there's not a lot to go on in the Auburn game, but I think based on the JUCO credentials, based on what you're bringing in, I think there are some expectations that he could see the field. And so when I look at it, I say, okay, this guy would automatically line up for that Hawk position, right? With Jason Gilliam, with Logan Brantley, maybe with a John Kamara, like he would make a lot of sense to put into that position. And then maybe you're talking about him. If he is, more the safety role, it'd be more of like the box safety role, I would imagine. Maybe you move Taylor Davis to more of kind of that free safety role this season. And you end up having like Lyric Rawls and a Laquan Robinson as kind of your box safeties. And you have like Taylor Davis and the Dye brothers or something as kind of your field safeties or something like that. I think it'll be very interesting, but it's a good thing to have that you have a player like this you can probably plug into the Hawk position should he, be good enough to be a starter for you, that you have that prototypical player that you probably want to play if the defense is similar to how it's been under Brian Borland. All right, let's continue on. They have an elite punter. That should help the defense too. Finn Lappin, let's talk about him next. Our episode of the show here on Locked on Jayhawks is brought to you by TurboTax. This is a message from sponsor Intuit TurboTax. Taxes were dealing with piles of paperwork, you're dealing with frustrating forms, and then waiting and wondering and worrying if you're going to get any money back. Well, now taxes are easily uploading your forms to a TurboTax expert who's matched to your unique tax situation, an expert who's backed by the latest technology, which cross-checks millions of data points for 100% accuracy. While they work on your taxes, you get real-time updates on their progress, and you get the most money back guaranteed, all while you go about your day. No stressing, no worrying, no waiting. Now this is taxes. Intuit TurboTax. Get an expert now on TurboTax.com. That is TurboTax.com. Only available with TurboTax Live full service. Real-time updates only in the iOS mobile app. See guarantee details at TurboTax.com/guarantees. All right, continuing on in this episode of Locked on Jayhawks. KU football's new punter, that would be Finn Lappin. He is an elite punter. Now, the only punter you had on the roster prior to this was Graydon Addison. I believe he's a walk-on redshirt senior. I believe he can be this year. You needed a punter into the program, right? You lose Damon Greaves, transfers over to Colorado, and I think Kansas upgraded at the punter position. Now, this is another Aussie, another player from Australia. He is 5'11", 178 pounds, from Melbourne, Australia. He spent one season at McNeese State at the FCS level, then entered the transfer portal, and now he joins Kansas as well. There's been some questions about what the eligibility is, because it's only 1 year of like American college football, but I think he was at another university in Australia. So like, I don't know how that accounts to all this. I mean, gosh, talk about the JUCO stuff, how that's going to work out with the NCAA. No idea on this. So he could be a sophomore. He could be a senior. I don't entirely know. At the very least, this dude is a stud. He wound up with 61 punts for the Cowboys of McNeese State, which is obviously at the FCS level. But like, and first of all, like, we've seen so many players come up from the FCS level, D2 level, like whatever it is, and have success. But like, obviously the big questions usually when you make that jump is, oh, are you going to be big enough? Are you going to be fast enough? Are you going to be able to keep up with the bigger and better athletes of the world, right? That's not really a thing when you're moving up from the punting position, right? Like, your job is the same. Sure, I guess guys can break through the block a little bit faster to block the punt. Maybe you have to get it off a little bit sooner, but like, I don't know. That doesn't seem, you're still punting the same exact football. Like, that doesn't change. So I don't think there's any like adjustment going from the FCS level to FBS level when you're just talking punting. Maybe you could argue field goal kicking because the crowds would be bigger and like it'd be more pressure. I don't know, but I don't think there's really much with punting. Anyway, 61 punts for the Cowboys, 46.1 yards per punt. He had a long of 68 yards this past season. And out of reference, you might be thinking, okay, how good is 46.1 yards per punt? Sounds pretty good. It would have finished second in the Big 12 this past season. At 46.1 yards per punt would have finished second in the Big 12. It would have finished 11th nationally. All the punters across the FBS, it would have finished 11th nationally if he would have qualified for the FBS. Obviously didn't, because he was part of the FCS. So this is like not me, overblowing this. He was an elite punter this past season. He had 8 touchbacks. He had 19 of his punts go inside the 20-yard line. So think about that. 61 punts, basically 1 out of every 3 punts ended up inside the 20-yard line. He had 21 more fair caught. So he had another, basically a third of his punts are getting fair caught where they're not getting returned at all. And then that doesn't even count for the 8 touchbacks. So really half of his punts are not getting returned. He also had 21 punts. So over a third of his punts were 50 or more yards. So this guy has an absolute booming leg. And I mean, the average shows that in general at 46.1, but 21 punts of 50 or more yards is incredible. And so again, like I expect him to come in and be the automatic starter at the punter position for KU. And like, if you just want to compare what Damon Greaves did this past season to what you're getting in Finn Lappin to show, what you can get from the punting position here. So Kansas finished 13th in the Big 12 this past season at 42.3 yards per punt. So that's 13th of 16 teams. Damon Greaves, if you look at net yards per punt, obviously there were some teams that maybe used two punters for whatever reason. Damon Greaves finished 19th in the Big 12 somehow in net yards per punt. Now, that's not all his fault on the net yards. Like, some of that could be the coverage, right? You give up a long touchdown to TCU. Like, that's not obviously going to help. But there also is a little bit of that on the punter. Like, you want more hang times that they don't have as much time to return. But, still, that'd be a huge increase for KU up to 46 yards per punt, right? 4 extra yards per punt. The extra time that you pin them inside the 20. I mean, there's been some fun analytics and numbers talking about, the expected points of if you pin a team inside the 10 versus if you pin them inside the 20 for their starting field position. Like, sometimes it can be the difference of 1 or 2 points, like half a point even, of expected points added on if you pin a team at the 7 versus, them having the ball at the 22 or something like that. And, it adds on over the course of the season. And you look at it here, going back to the number of 21 punts of 50 or more yards for Finn Lapin. Do you know how many Damon Greaves had in his 2-year career at Kansas? The correct answer would be 7. So over 22 games played at Kansas for Damon Greaves, he had 7 punts of 50 or more yards. Finn Lapin had 21 in one season at McNeese State, 3 times the amount. So KU added an elite punter, and ideally you don't have to use him. Ideally you have the Colorado game where Damon Greaves' parents came out and they didn't punt at all. Like, ideally you're not having to use them. But you want to know when you have to use them, you can trust them to pin them deep. You can trust them to boom it long if you need that. And for, I think, a coach in Lance Leipold who, isn't the most aggressive coach. You look at the number of 4th down attempts that Kansas has attempted over the last couple of years compared to the rest of the Big 12. Like, Kansas ranks near the bottom in the Big 12. So if you're going to be a more conservative team, you need to invest resources in those players, in your field goal kicker, in your punter, in those things that are going to, right? If you're going to do them more, you better have good ones at it. And I think Kansas has done a good job in the portal of doing this. They added Leif Marjan, the strong kicker from South Alabama. Now you add Finn Lappin from McNeese State as well. All right, what's still the remaining need list for KU football? We'll talk about that on the other side. Our episode of the show today is brought to you by Game Time, which has a new feature called Game Time Picks that makes getting tickets for events even easier. Filters out the fluff to show you only incredible deals on great seats so you don't have to waste time searching through thousands of tickets. I mean, I adore the Game Time app. It's my favorite of the different ticket sites because the interface is awesome. It's easy to work around. It's easy to see where the seats are. You can literally zoom in right on the app itself and see certain sections, certain seats in the section. It's going to show you what like the cheapest ticket in the section is. You can flick on the Game Time Pick stuff. Like it's just really easy for me to maneuver, and I find it very easy to find the best tickets possible because, sometimes there's like certain venues that I go to where I'm like, I love sitting in this section. And with Game Time, it makes it a lot easier to go to those specific tickets. So take guesswork out of buying tickets with Game Time. Download the Game Time app, create an account, and use code LOCKEDONCollege for $20 off your first purchase. Terms apply. Again, create an account and redeem code LOCKEDONCollege, LOCKEDONCOLLEGE for $20 off. Download Game Time today. Last minute tickets, lowest price guaranteed. Finishing things up on this episode of Locked on Jayhawks, and don't forget to tune into our Kansas-Cincinnati recap from over the weekend if you didn't already. We're going to be talking a little more Shaquille Moore on tomorrow's episode of the show, and we'll talk a little more KU football. Then on Wednesday, we'll have our Kansas-Iowa State preview. We will recap that one later in the week as well. So plenty to get to on this week's episodes of Locked on Jayhawks. Make sure you're subscribed anywhere you get your podcast or on our YouTube page. So what is left on the need list for KU? you go down and you look at the amount of transfers that they have brought in. They've covered their bases pretty well all the way through. But I think there's pretty clear, like, if you were to tier these out, to me, I think tier one of the needs list would be a strong side defensive end. That would be the defensive end who maybe, weighs a little bit more. He's going to be on the strong side of the field. So, like, makes it more imperative for stopping the run to have that guy, be a little bit more bulked up. And it doesn't mean that it's like 300-pounder, but like, in some of these years past, we've seen that guy for Kansas be, like a Malcolm Lee or Jeremy Robinson, like players who are closer to, mid 250s, like 260. If you can get up to 265, like great. Whereas the weak side guy has maybe been more of the guy who, has been lacking weight, like a Kyron Johnson, an Austin Booker, that you can get away with that a little bit more. And you look across the roster for KU, obviously there's still a whole off season to be had for weight gains and for players getting up that total, but it's a lot of players who are closer to that, 240 range, where again, maybe one or two of them is able to add to that amount. Or maybe honestly, like going back to what is DK McDonald going to do on the defensive side of the ball, maybe it is just more of a balanced system with the two defensive ends and how they play it. I don't know. That'll kind of remain to be seen. But I think that would make a lot of sense for them to add that guy, because you lost Jeremy Robinson, you lost Dylan Woodkey, you lost Ron McGee. Like, those are all guys who could play that position for you. And, in the case of Robinson and Woodkey, gobbled up like basically all the snaps at that position this past season. And so I don't really know who that guy would be on this year's, like, By Job maybe makes some sense. Like, he seems to be a physical, strong guy that you could probably add maybe even a little bit more weight to. Like, maybe he could play there. I have no idea about the rehab with Dylan Brooks coming off the season-ending injury. He was, I think, closer to like the 240 range, but maybe he can add a little bit of weight coming off, the injury that he had. I don't know how that works. And again, maybe it just ends up being more balanced. But that would be the clear one. And then I think there's not even a tier 2 need. I think that's just like tier 1. But if you were to add something else, I would say just like another offensive lineman. But I also don't really think it makes sense to add another offensive lineman for like depth. I guess to a certain standpoint, like, you can never have enough depth. And, to another standpoint, you have all these extra scholarship. Like, you can go above 85 this year because of the new rules. So, like, what does it really matter? And if you add another player who has future value as well, like the lineman you've added so far that can be around for multiple years, then that's still a good thing because you're getting them for multiple years. But I do think a lot of those guys they added into the program, as much as I liked the additions and like that they're covering their bases both for depth and long-term, I do have questions about how many of those guys are going to be ready to maybe play starter level snaps in year one at Kansas. And so I think it would make the most sense, if you are going to add another offensive lineman, go add a starter level player. And it doesn't even necessarily need to be, an All-American or anything. Like, go add we didn't see this guy like too much on the field this season, because I think the guys like Michael Ford and Kobe Baines did a good job locking down those positions. But like Darrell Simmons, you added him from the portal from Iowa State. He was an experienced player who had been a starter in the conference and ended up being just kind of on the 2D, being like a backup for you that rotated in here or there. But like that type of player, I think if you added him to this year's roster, you would more so view it as like, okay, we expect him to start. So I think that's the type of player that I'd be kind of looking at of like, can you add someone to that level? But besides that, like, I feel pretty good about where they're at with the numbers of the roster. And you just hope you make it through healthy through spring ball. And if you don't at a certain position, then that's when you go strike at those positions and be like, okay, let's get in more. And obviously you're always at a point where it's like, oh, but if we can add this really good player, we feel good about where we're at, but this really good player wants to come here, you still take them too. That'll do it for this episode of Locked On Jayhawks. You can find our show anywhere you get your podcast, including on our YouTube page. We'll be back tomorrow to talk a little Shaquille Moore for KU MVP. That on the next Locked On Jayhawks. See you then.